Reality is incomplete. What could such a statement possibly mean? I will elaborate in this paper through 6 arguments that reality is impossible to totalize, that its presentation is always accompanied by the unpresentable, and that far from being a pessimistic conclusion, this guarantees that reality is open and full of potential. I will examine contemporary mathematics, quantum physics, and the work of Hegel with interventions from Lacan, Badiou, and Zizek. What I specifically add to the current work on reality's incompletion is that incompletion can be read in a distinctly spatial way. At the end of this paper, the second half of it, I will discuss the incompletion of reality via natural and logical space, and perhaps what we could call an evental space of quantum physics. Part 1, mathematics. Almost 100 years ago, in 1928, German mathematician David Hilbert proposed what he called the appearance problem, Erscheinungsproblem. He postulated that it would be possible in mathematics to develop an algorithm that would decide with conviction and clarity if a mathematical formula were true or false. Imagine an algorithm through which we could discover the truth, at least mathematically speaking. Some sort of divine algorithm, a meta-algorithm, a harbinger of truth that could settle with quick calculation any debate. What would become of discourse, at least in mathematical terms, were this possible? Would this demonstrate not only mathematical logic as consistent, but perhaps truth and reality as a whole? We do not need to answer this question because Kurt Gödel resolved this for us in 1931 with the publication of his 2 theorems on incompleteness. Gödel answered Hilbert's program, which was a broad attempt by Hilbert to demonstrate that mathematics could be unified in a formal language, in a system that would eliminate contradiction. Gödel answered this question posed by Hilbert, dashing any sort of dream of unification, of completion, or of wholeness with his 2 landmark theorems. Gödel's 2 theorems on incompletion decisively demonstrated that mathematics is inconsistent when taken as a whole system. What this means is that mathematics adopts certain axioms, certain presuppositions when making a proof, and there's no unified set of axioms that could demonstrate all the proofs accepted regarding natural numbers. In other words, we cannot explain all of math in its totality. It is localized in its truths, with each proof relying on a unique set of axioms. This, of course, does not mean that math is just made up. Math, of course, works. It's instead that math emerges. Indeed, math is one way, we could argue, through which the truth speaks, through which the truth emerges. But we cannot unify math into a consistent language. It's full of inconsistencies. It's full of paradoxes. What does this tell us of truth and of reality? Gödel's theorems demonstrate a paradox in themselves. If mathematics is consistently inconsistent, this in turn means that it's sometimes consistent. And this is the math we know. Math is mostly consistent. Things literally add up. But more complex math deals precisely with the gaps within mathematical structure itself. For example, prior to Hilbert's program and Gödel's theorems, Bertrand Russell published what has become known as Russell's paradox in 1901. Russell's paradox stipulates that the set of all normal sets is neither normal nor abnormal. To be normal, a set does not contain itself. An abnormal set, on the other hand, does contain itself. So if we to think of a set of all normal sets, which type of set is that? If we called it normal, it would contain itself and thus produce a contradiction. If we called it abnormal, it would not contain itself, and this again is a contradiction. I'll give you another paradox that sort of speaks to the same problem, the Barber paradox. This was presented to Russell, he wrote, but he doesn't tell us by whom, but this is to elaborate his paradox. In this example, imagine a barber who cuts the hair of all the men in a town who do not cut their own hair. So who cuts the barber's hair? You can see the paradox emerge here. If the barber cuts his own hair, then he can't have his hair cut by the barber because the barber only cuts the hair of men who do not cut their own hair. But if the barber does not cut his own hair, well, then the barber must be the one who cuts it, and so on and so on. You see that this is a paradox. So mathematics, of course, helps us demonstrate paradox. And in this case, for Russell, the rules of the system produce a hole, a loop, a gap. We cannot resolve who cuts the barber's hair. We get a null output, something unpresentable within the terms of presentation. What I will argue in this paper is that being itself precisely contains its own paradox, its own loop, its own void. There is something unpresentable about being that is maintained in its presentation. This void, this loop, this incompletion of being is the real, in a Lacanian sense, of being itself. I'm, of course, following Lacan very much in this paper. So back to Gödel. We call Gödel's theorems the incompleteness theorems because they demonstrate that mathematics itself is incomplete. Not only can we demonstrate insurmountable gaps within mathematics, Gödel demonstrates that math, when taken as a whole, does not add up. It can't be totalized. It can't be unified. We cannot count it as a one. Theorems work, but they conflict. Hence, math is localized in its truths. Moreover, math remains open structurally and open for debate in its development, precisely because it is barred in its ability to be totalized as a whole. Not only do we learn that mathematics is a fractured system, we also learn from Gödel that, as Jacques Lacan wrote in his 1960 text, The Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire, il n'y a pas de métalangage qui puisse être parlé. There is no meta-language that can be spoken. Lacan deployed this statement to demonstrate that there is no meta-language that will guarantee consistency to reality. In other words, there is no language of language, no ultimate system that makes sense of the world. Precisely. So neither spoken language nor formal logic nor mathematics, which is sometimes called the language of the universe, can offer us a consistent composition, a consistent mapping, a totalization of reality, or more pointedly, of itself. Logical systems, spoken language, and mathematics remain open. In philosophy, therefore, we're not seeking to totalize a system of meanings, but as I argue, we're precisely examining the contradictions implicit in thought and logic, and precisely in reality. This is far from a pessimistic conclusion because just as mathematical incompletion demonstrates an open system, reality's incompletion guarantees the world is open and full of potential. My particular incursion into this debate is one on space, which we're going to get to, but first let's talk about quantum physics. So part 2, quantum physics. The shift I want to make is from understanding mathematics as a system of presentation as structurally incomplete to understanding reality as incomplete. Mathematics as a presentation of reality is not just an introduction, however. In a very strong sense, presentation is reality, or as Hegel put it, Sein ist Schein, being is shine, being is appearance. Let's develop this through quantum physics. Some of us are probably familiar with the wave function. When reality is observed on a very small scale, we find that particles act like waves. There's a spread of statistical possibilities in terms of, for example, where a particle might be, which looks like a wave. So for example, there's a 10% chance the particle is here, 20% chance it's here, 10% chance it's here, and so on. The wave function collapses when we observe the system. The word collapse is used because the possibilities change from a 10% chance the particle is here to 0%, from a 20% chance the particle is here to 100%. It's been actualized as such. The possibilities collapse all at a point, the point where the particle is. Thus, the wave function collapse transforms possibilities into reality. But prior to collapse, the possibilities themselves have a certain ontological dignity to them. Let's take another example, the electron cloud. I'm sure we're very familiar with this. Contemporary physics argues that the electron exists somewhere in the electron cloud. It's not that the electron has a position and we cannot know it. It's precisely understood to be that the electron is ontologically indeterminate until we give it a position through our observation. This is the ontological dignity of indeterminacy. The particle's ontological status, both in the electron cloud and in the example of the wave function, is indeterminate until it is determined. That is what it is. This represents a substantive shift from classical physics. Let's take a page from Werner Heisenberg here. In 1958, he writes, quote, "Classical physics can be considered as that idealization in which we speak about the world as entirely separated from ourselves," end quote. In contrast to classical physics that saw a brute empiric reality as outside of us, as objective and in this way static, modern quantum physics conceives that the fluidity of reality is not simply some Heraclitean state of motion, but that more strongly the observer and the observed are entangled. And I don't mean to misuse this word, but it's a really nice way to think of our relationship with the world. And I take this specifically from Karen Berard's 2007 book, Meeting the Universe Halfway. That when we collapse this fluidity, we bring the fluctuating indeterminacy of nature to a specified point, we make it into an object. We objectivize it as such. In the same vein, Heisenberg states that, quote, "We cannot disregard the fact that natural science is formed by men. Natural science does not simply describe and explain nature. It is a part of the interplay between nature and ourselves. It describes nature as exposed to our method of questioning," end quote. This is what we have examined, that nature is exposed to our method of questioning. But now I'd like to speak of a nuance in the development of quantum physics from Heisenberg to Bohr. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle states that the more we know about a particle's velocity, the less we know about its position, and vice versa. Velocity and position are in an inverse relationship. We are constitutively limited in our knowledge at the quantum level, Heisenberg argues. What Niels Bohr does in response to Heisenberg is radicalize the uncertainty principle. Rather than asserting we just don't know the velocity of the electron when we determine its position, Niels Bohr argues that the electron maintains a status of ontological indeterminacy vis-a-vis its position and velocity. I also borrow this from Karen Barad. I argue that Heisenberg's position would be the epistemological one, that we are barred in our knowledge, whereas Bohr takes the next step to argue that in a very strong ontological sense, the electron is indeterminate until we determine it. Thus, the dialectic I propose we examine is one of indeterminacy and determinacy as two statuses of ontological existence within nature that, in the spirit of quantum physics, weave the observer and the observed together. Quantum physics thus offers a revolution in our thinking of reality itself. Instead of embracing some sort of dualistic model that my internality is sharply distinct from my externality, quantum physics sees, to put it in a Hegelian parlance, substance as subject. In a way that collapses idealism and materialism, just as the wave function collapses to a point, subjective interaction with our environment demonstrates that subjectivity shapes objectivity as such. Pretty big. And so, how does this tie into my thesis that reality is incomplete? What we learn from quantum physics is that there is incompletion implicit in any physical system, what is known as quantum indeterminacy. A quantum state is fundamentally in flux, and once we observe it, we collapse or destroy. They use this language, destroy, which is really great. We collapse or destroy its state with measurement. If we take quantum physics seriously, we can make the move from understanding not only our knowledge is incomplete, but reality itself. This is the point I'm attempting to make here. It's not that mathematical incompletion demonstrates that there's some knowledge out there, we just haven't accessed it. Gödel's incompleteness theorems demonstrate that mathematics is structurally and will always be incomplete, just by its nature. In the same vein, quantum physics is not telling us the electron has a velocity and a position, we just don't know it. In a stronger sense, if we follow Bohr's complementarity principle, that quantum physics is telling us that indeterminacy is irremovable from a physical system, that the system relies on indeterminacy in its ontological constitution. My argument, therefore, is that we can view this indeterminacy precisely as an incompletion, as a potentiality that keeps reality open. Physical systems are not only incomplete in terms of knowability, it's precisely in themselves that they maintain a state of incompletion which keeps them open to movement, change, and likewise open to being determined. And to hedge against attempting critique, it's not a relativist argument. Quantum physics precisely tells us that objectivity is constituted by subjectivity. It's a very Hegelian argument, in fact. The objective world collapses to a discrete point thanks to subjective intervention. We make the indeterminate world into an object. Section 3 with Zizek. If we were to think critically of ontology in light of quantum physics, we must take seriously the work of Slavoj Zizek, who has been working on this topic for the last 30 years. It is Zizek who has maintained from a Lacanian standpoint that reality is structured around a void. In other words, that reality is incomplete, that something fundamentally unpresentable accompanies presentation, just as we saw with Russell's paradox and the Barber paradox, in which we examined several null outputs that appear in mathematics. In this way, we can make the stronger argument that unpresentability accompanies presentation in mathematics. The same is true in quantum physics. Systems must maintain a state of incompletion in order to be presentable at all. This is not a limit in our measuring tools or in our knowledge, as classical physics would assert, but instead incompletion is ontologically constitutive of reality itself. As Zizek writes, quote, instead of filling in this gap by way of proposing its positive explanation, we should displace it, posit it at the very heart of reality itself, end quote. Indeed, incompletion, as well as the unpresentability of reality, is not something to be ironed out. This gap is constitutive of reality itself. Were there no gap, there would be no reality. This gap, I will later explore, is that of potentiality. So let's thread the needle on the link between appearance and reality. Mathematics describes an appearance of being. Recall Hilbert's problem was called the appearance problem, Einstein's problem. I also mentioned earlier that in Hegel's science of logic, being is appearance, being is shine. Being is not the thing behind appearance. It is not the thing that shines. Being is the shine. Being is appearance itself. Zizek writes, quote, "It is a quantum level which is hallucinated, not yet ontologically fully constituted, floating, ambiguous, and it is this shift to the higher level of appearance, our perceived reality, that makes it into a hard reality. Therein resides the embarrassing paradox encountered by 20th century hard sciences. In quantum physics, the appearance or the perception of a particle determines its reality. The very emergence of hard reality out of the quantum fluctuation through the collapse of the wave function is the outcome of observation, i.e. the intervention of consciousness," end quote. Quantum physics precisely tells us that appearance, that our intervention of consciousness, is what constitutes objective reality. This collapse of objectivity and subjectivity must be read in a post-Cartesian way. Subject and substance are entangled, not distinct. Hence, it may at first appear that I was speaking in two different registers, in the epistemology of mathematics and the empiric ontology of science. But if we take Hegel seriously, that being is appearance, then we can conclude that epistemology and ontology collapse. How we perceive the collapse of the wave function is reality itself. Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the quantum incompleteness describe the same phenomenon, that reality itself is incomplete. This is my central thesis. Digging more into Zizek, he makes a very bold argument that reality is quote-unquote not all, citing Jacques Lacan's formulas of sexuation. The feminine not all, Lacan argues, exceeds the symbolic as such. Woman is never registered as a full subject. She doesn't add up to one in the masculine sense because she exceeds subjectivity. She is less than one, she is more than one, but she's never a one. We cannot count her as one. Zizek writes that reality is, quote, not simply without boundary, but an empty boundary which makes it non-all, end quote. I want to explore this empty boundary of reality next through a spatial reading of Hegel. I will argue that it is space itself, both on the micro and the macro scale, that fundamentally keeps reality open. I argue that reality is incomplete, but likewise there is something in reality more than reality itself. It likewise exceeds itself. This is the feminine not all, postulated by Zizek and vis-a-vis Lacan. I build on this argument by positing that reality is space. It guarantees its not all status. Section 4, natural space. Hegel's philosophy of nature begins properly with a discussion of space. In this way, it can be argued that space is grounding of nature itself. Hegel describes space as indifferent, homogeneous, continuous. Space, therefore, presents a particularly interesting paradox in the work of Hegel. We would typically think of Hegel's work as mediated by difference. Indeed, mediation is itself a relation of difference. Hegel's work unfolds through the movement of differences, through the movement of contradiction. They have a certain force, to use one of Hegel's favorite terms from physics. So in Hegel's system of differentiation, how could we have something that is in itself homogeneous? This is the paradox of space. Space's homogeneity means that the space over here is the same as this other space over here. Hence, space is continuous. It goes on and on. It's all the same. This is likewise what we can call space indifferent. It's without difference. It is emptiness. All space is indifferent in the same sense that it is completely penetrable. The classic debate on space climaxed in the 18th century between Leibniz, who contended that space is simply relational, and Clarke, who followed the Newtonian theory that space is absolute. It was Newton who sought to create an absolute system of physics. He called space God sensorium, which takes the form of an ether, a sort of stage upon which differences in reality play out. Leibniz, on the other hand, contended that space was not substance but merely relative. That's a quote from Leibniz. Leibniz would argue that there is no a priori space, but it is through our interpretations of the world and through objects themselves that space arises. Were we to subtract everything, there would be nothing left, not even space. In contrast, an absolutist account would contend that there are fixed points in space, that there is an absolute center, that each quadrant of space has a unique identity. Were we to subtract everything substantive from the universe, a spatial backdrop would persist. You can see emerge here a particular paradox regarding nothingness as such, or in this case, space as such. Is space nothingness or is it something? It was Democritus who called space somewhere between being and non-being. Hence, space is quite the ontological question as it shreds the line between being and nothingness. What was Hegel's position on this question of an absolute or a relative space? In philosophy of nature, one of the early Zusatzes states that absolute space is thought to be the truth of space, I'm quoting, but relative space is something much higher, for it is the determinate space of some material body. It is rather the truth of abstract space to exist as a material body, end quote. Hence, Hegel seems to side with Leibniz in that space is determinate of material bodies. Indeed, like in quantum physics, we collapse material to a point in space. But this would be too simplistic of a way to read Hegel. The Zusatz furthers with particular reference to Leibniz. Certainly it can be said, quoting again, quote, certainly it can be said that space is an arrangement, some sort of ordering, Ordnung. For it is of course an external determination, but it is not merely an external determination, it is rather in its very self externality, Äußerlichkeit. The absolute nature of space, therefore, is that it is external, it is self-external. The space's indifference, continuity, and homogeneity can primarily be read as fundamentally relative insofar as space's indifference, continuity, and homogeneity are sublated by differences by arrangements of objects in space. But space is likewise absolute precisely in that it is absolutely external. In this way, space implies that there is some sort of orientation. It must be external to, for example, the self. Space orients based on the position of the self, or we could argue from some chosen point. To take a page from 20th century science, Ernst Mach refuted Newton's absolute conception of space by arguing for space's relativity. While space is relative, he emphasized we need to pick a point of orientation in order to interpret data. He often chose the stars. I take Hegel's position that space is absolutely external, but that space itself does not represent absolutely fixed points. It is instead relational. Indeed, this is the advancement of Einstein, who drew heavily on Mach in the 20th century. General relativity theory, as I'm sure many of us are familiar with it, argues that space and time are not absolutes, but are experienced relatively depending on one's perspective. The classic example here is that motion aboard a train appears different from a stationary perspective. Indeed, what this example more pointedly illustrates is that there is no stationary perspective, but we can talk about that. Again, this could be a bit Heraclitean, all is in motion, but what we learn from Hegel is precisely that things do get stuck. There is a point of orientation, even if it is arbitrary. What does this all have to do with reality's incompletion? It has a lot to do with it, I hope. What we're learning from thinking space is that space goes on and on. It is continuous indifference. Its continuous indifference guarantees that it will always be there, its there-ness itself, as we as spirited agents keep determining. That said, it would be a mistake to describe natural space as infinite. Indeed, there's a debate about the exact status of the universe as infinite, finite, shaped like a torus, or in this one viewpoint in the scientific, or there's a viewpoint in the scientific community that space is indeterminate. In philosophy of nature, it's stated that however remotely I place a star, I can go beyond it, for the universe is nowhere nailed up with boards. I think this is critical, because space is fundamentally indifferent and indeterminate, meaning it will keep extending as long as there is an agent to determine. I can reach my arm out to the farthest reaches of space, or I can zoom in on the smallest particle, and I will always find more to discover. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel writes, quote, "If it is no longer easy to find new whole things, then reason must turn back to those already found in order to divide them still further, to analyze them, and then to track down new aspects of thinghood in them. This restless, unceasing instinct can never run out of material, to find a new genus of distinctive significance, or even to discover a new planet." To Hegel, nature is that which will never live up to its notion. We can never have a complete philosophy of nature, he writes. Why is this? It's in part because nature is just indifferent stuff. It's full of contingencies. We cannot totalize nature. Any categorization of nature we make, nature will find an exception. Nature, too, is consistently inconsistent. Hegel argues that nature is indifference, just as space is indifference. This means that nature is ontologically indeterminate until we determine it. That's one of my central arguments. There are natural differences, of course, in nature, but they just don't make a difference. It doesn't matter, for example, if there are 1,000 or 1,001 trees in the forest over there. Nature is continuously spatial. It's continuous temporally as well, as Cronus destroys without differentiation. There is always more nature for us to determine as we transform its ontological status from indeterminate to determinate, precisely because nature is spatial. Critical to this argument is that natural space bars nature from totalization. Space will always accompany my extending arm to the furthest reaches of space. Further space will be found at the most infinitesimal level, as scientists today continue to split particles into smaller and smaller subparticles. It is space that is indifferent in itself, and this is the grounding for an indifferent, continuous, and ontologically indeterminate nature. From the vantage point of space, reality is therefore incomplete because we cannot totalize it. Reality, like nature, has an open boundary. We can never draw a circle around all of nature, around all of reality. We cannot maintain a complete philosophy of nature because it is contingent, indeterminate, and continuous, because it is fundamentally spatial. Nature's indeterminacy is a function of its indifferent spatiality, which guarantees its incompletion. Part 5, space is potentiality. It is in this reading that we can understand reality as evental. It's Carlo Rovelli who calls nature evental, but this I tweak to argue that it's not nature that's evental, but reality. Nature is ontologically indeterminate until we determine it. This is our lesson from quantum physics. Our determination, as we saw earlier, is what is evental, what causes the wave function to collapse, what transforms ontological indeterminacy into determinate reality. Thus, space is co-emergent and evental with our determinations, but likewise, we can see space as the harbinger of potentiality. This is the great paradox of space. We can name space, we can substantialize it, we can call it a being. Space as relational precisely means we have determined it. We've determined the objects that occupy it. And in this naming, we've brought space into existence. But likewise, space is a nothingness, an emptiness, a promise of always more to come, an extension itself that guarantees an open universe. The flip side of space's eventual emergence is that it holds the promise of always more, of reality's ability to extend further and further based on agential determination. Potentiality occupies a strange ontological position. Just as we saw with the wave function, there's a certain dignity and seriousness with which we must take potentiality of the particle's position before the function collapses. This potentiality is an ontological state of indeterminateness. The potentiality both does and does not exist. The particle is not yet placed, which is typically how we would define existence, that something is placed in a given field of orientation. And yet, like in the electron cloud as well, there's a certain probabilistic spread of positionality that is nevertheless indeterminate. Probability hedges into reality while remaining just at its border, that is, at the border of determination. This is why we can see that potentiality is spatial. It is just beyond our fingertips of determination as the promise of something before it is something. Were nature not spatial, all would be at what point dimensionless and collapsed. But because nature is spatial, it is extensive, indeterminate, and full of potential for further discovery, further events, further entwinement between consciousness and matter, which is reality itself. Thus, we can read incompletion as guaranteeing potentiality. Were reality complete, there would not be an openness of potentiality. All would be determined. And this is the temptation of the classical physics position, i.e. of determinism, that we can come to know the properties of all reality and determine with certainty the outcome of any experiment, the outcome of any future, thereby erasing any contingency. This, of course, is fantasy, but there's, of course, many good reasons why we fantasize about completion. We can eliminate a deterministic worldview precisely with the potentiality of space that structures nature itself, that guarantees openness, that extends nature onward and onward. Section 6, logical space. I want to talk about the space of logic precisely because reality, as I've been arguing, is the weaving of logic into the indeterminacy of nature by spirited beings. It's a nice Hegelian triad. Quantum physics teaches us that reality is the interaction of consciousness, of observation, with indeterminate material reality. What conscious spirited beings are doing in this observation is precisely evaluating and interpreting the indeterminacy of nature with the tools of logic. For Hegel, logic and nature are two distinct registers. His Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences is split into 3 volumes: the science of logic, the philosophy of nature, and the philosophy of spirit. Nature is that which is external to logic. Nature is externality. It is not that logic is an internality per se, but simply that it is nature which is external to it. What then is the relationship between logic and nature? I argue that spirited beings weave logic into nature, and this does work much of the time. We can categorize nature, we can manipulate nature, we can use logic to, in a Heideggerian sense, bring forth the potential of nature qua physis. But Hegel underlines this: nature always exceeds logic. It is contingent. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel writes, quote, "What observing reason is doing to be examined in the moments of its movement as it incorporates nature, spirit, and finally the relation of both as sensuous being, and when, as an existing actuality, it seeks itself." Hence, as spirited beings use reason to discover nature, to discover spirit as well, reason in fact simply finds itself. Hegel furthers, quote, "Here at the limits of the universal, where such an enormous field is opened up for it, What has been found is, instead of immeasurable wealth, in fact, only the limits of nature and of its own doing. It can no longer know whether what seems to have being in itself is not a contingency. This is what logic discovers in nature, that it can weave itself into nature, but it will be encased in nature's contingencies. Nature is that which is external to logic. With science, with quantum physics and empirical observation, we are precisely weaving logic into the fabric of nature itself. We are weaving differences into an indifferent space, into indifferent nature. We are transforming potentiality into determined actualities. So let's speak of logical spatiality. Hegel's Science of Logic infamously begins with two passages, one on being pure being and the other on nothing, the pure nothing. Without any reference, both being and nothing are described as void, leer or lere. In other words, being and nothing are totally indeterminate. They are floating in logical space, which is properly what the void is. This is how we can translate the German leer as either emptiness or void. The void is distinctly logical, not natural, because the void is necessarily an endless emptiness, and clearly there's no correlate in nature. So how do we exit the state of logical indeterminacy? We must orient ourselves in the void in order to bring forth becoming. Once we are oriented, we can properly begin to think. Hegel defines determinate being as the unity of being and non-being, or, quote, being in a certain place, end quote. I take this to mean a logical place. Once we are logically oriented, once we have put our stake in the ground, we can place being. Logical beings are given meaning, given determinacy, because they are in relation to each other. This is not a static orientation. Logical placements are constantly in flux as we reorient and reorganize logical placements and categories. Effectively, what we are doing is sketching a relation of points between logical identities, deriving determinacy from their positions and relationality. What this definition of being in a certain place yields is two paradoxes: being without a place and nothing in its place. In other words, the one and the void, being without a place and nothing in its place. This is a spatial paradox that arises in logic. When we try to name something as one, it always appears against the backdrop of the void. If we were then to totalize all that there is, the void included, to name everything as one, we would again see the void appear as backdrop. The void always reappears. To Alain Badiou, this is the errant appearance of the void that emerges whenever we count as one a presented being. Hegel writes that in the unification of the one and the void, quote, the unity itself thus withdraws to one side, is therefore lowered to existence, and there it is confronted by its other determination standing over against it, negation as such, and likewise as the existence of the nothing as the void. Indeed, the totalization of anything into one is confronted by negativity, by the reappearance of the void. The void encircles any logical totality as a space of logical indeterminacy. So we can see a connection here with nature, because nature is spatial indifference as such. Weaving logic into nature is what differentiates nature. We name nature. We count being as one in a Badiousian reading. Outside of this logic is the indeterminacy of nature itself. Let's take a page from Malad and Delar, who writes in his 2014 text, What is a Name? Quote, the name always names the unnameable, or rather, by naming it, it always produces the unnameable. The real of the name is what escapes naming, yet stands at its core, end quote. To name nature is to totalize nature, to count it as one, to introduce logical delimitations into the indifference and multiplicity of nature. In doing so, we produce the unnameable. Delar writes, or as we discussed earlier with mathematics, the unpresentable always accompanies the presentable. The void errantly appears alongside any count, per Badiou. Thus, when spirited beings logically organize nature, we introduce difference into indifference. We weave the void, the logical void, into the empty space of nature. To recall the atom and the void of Democritus, to name the atom is to weave the void into the void. This is the negation of negation that yields something, a less than nothing, to put it in Zizek's terms, a less than nothing that is being against the void. This is the incompletion of reality at its simplest. We weave nothingness into nothingness. We weave the logical void into natural space. The one, Hegel tells us, is void. It's emptiness. What makes it one is that we have named the void, we have called it a one. Badiou calls this naming of the void the proper name of being. In naming the void, we weave logic into nature. We distinguish nothingness from itself. This is the one and the void. What this means is that naming nature both counts nature as one and introduces the contradiction of totalization. It presents being and presents its unpresentable underside. Totalizing any aspect of nature is reliant on its very incomplete void core being brought to the fore. What I hope to demonstrate is that when we logically organize natural being, we cut in different space with logical differentiation. In doing so, reality maintains a state of incompletion because we are weaving the logical void into reality itself. This is what Zizek means when he writes that we should situate center stage the gap at the very heart of reality. This gap is the emptied out void that guarantees ontological constitution. We learn from quantum physics that the intervention of consciousness into material reality is what transforms potentiality into objectivity. Objectivity, therefore, comes at a price. Objects are not made perfectly solid, but maintain a fundamental emptiness vis-a-vis the void at their core. Moreover, if we consider the connection between logical space and mathematics, we can see that any system of math cannot be totalized because it is likewise inscribed against the void. Math is a presentation of being, and thus likewise is accompanied by its own hiccups, by beings in completion, but void gaps and loopholes that the paradoxes we explored earlier so perfectly elaborate. And math as a whole cannot be made into a smooth and coherent system because it will always point to some greater indeterminacy, some incompletion, because it is inscribed against the indeterminacy of the void itself. Conclusion. In summary, I examined 6 ways we can call reality incomplete, all of which fundamentally hinge on a spatiality of logic and nature. First, I examined mathematics as incomplete. Math both demonstrates logical loopholes that can't be stuffed up, and mathematics itself as a system fails to be consistently totalized. Math is a way we can discuss the appearance of being. It is a way that being presents itself. It is one way we can organize being. As we learned from quantum physics and from Hegel, being is appearance. The way quantum reality appears is the hard reality that arises from quantum potentiality. Thus, to take a page from Badiou, math is ontology. In its incompletion per Gödel, likewise means, in its incompletion, like per Gödel, this likewise means that being itself is incomplete. Second, we examined quantum physics and learned that ontological incompletion is a necessary part of the physical system. Again, it is here that I argue that it's not a gap of knowledge that keeps us from knowing the position and velocity of the atom, but per Bohr, indeterminacy is part of any physical system. This is what maintains the very potential at the heart of reality itself. Moreover, we saw that subject and reality are co-constitutive. As I later argued via Hegel, spirit weaves logic into nature. Third, we briefly examined Zizek's work. Indeed, Zizek and this reading of Hegel with quantum physics is a very central inspiration for this project. And his thesis that reality is not all, fractured and cracked. Zizek has expertly read quantum physics, genuinely, to argue for being as appearance and for potentiality as part and parcel to nature's incompletion. Fourth, I introduced my work on space. Natural space guarantees that we can't totalize reality as it is extensive and continuous alongside any agential determination. This is the potential of nature, but there is always more to determine, barring its completion. We saw that space is emergent in a determinate fashion, but likewise, it's the ever-present indeterminacy that encases determination. This is why we can call nature simply space. It's just the continuous indifference beyond logic. Fifth, I argued for space as potentiality as precisely that space of open determinacy. Finally, sixth, I examined what I call logical space in order to understand that how the wave function collapse works. It's the intertwining of logic into nature by spirited beings. As Hegel writes, reason finds itself in such a pursuit. We weave the logical void into our assessment of nature, guaranteeing an incomplete reality that is centered around various empty gaps. The incompletion of reality is thus not only to be thought of it in terms of extensive nature, but precisely that our logical determinations only make sense because they present a being alongside the unpresentable. So in conclusion, reality is incomplete because its appearance, which we logically determine, is interwoven with the void. The void always reappears as we logically determine nature. Nature itself guarantees its own incompletion in its extension by its own spatiality that precedes determination. Precisely to think of naming nature, therefore, is to weave the void into empty space, producing a reality that is a negation of a negation. Thank you.
Thank you.